Welcome, and in this lesson, we're going to learn about working with firewalls. Now, in terms of firewalls for the Red Hat Certified System Administrator exam, there's a few options that we can consider using. Both of these options integrate into or with the NetFilter Linux kernel. NetFilter is really what does the magic. It allows filtering of specific ports in and out of your Linux system. However, to control NetFilter, we have two different services or pieces of software which allow us to do that. The first is very common, and that's called iptables. It's a little bit harder to use, it's a little bit older, and when you start working with IPv4 and IPv6, it requires two pieces of software, iptables and then IP6 tables. So we're going to learn to work with what's considered default in a base install for Red Hat, which is Firewall-D. It's a lot easier to use than iptables. If you are more comfortable with iptables, that means you're already pretty good with this objective and you don't need to watch this lesson. However, I would encourage you to learn a little bit more about Firewall-D. So Firewall-D also integrates in with our Linux kernel NetFilter module. And what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to configure it on a system. Now, I'm going to encourage you to start to linuxacademy.com lab servers. You'll notice I'm actually VNC'd into my first server, and then I'm going to SSH into my second server from my VNC'd session. Because what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to test it. So on my first session over here, make sure you're operating as a privileged user or the root user. And what we need to do is we need to ensure we have a few packages installed. Now, we can manage Firewall-D from a GUI-based interface, and we can also manage it from the command line. I'm going to show you how to do both. So we're going to go ahead and install the packages for them. So we'll do a yum install Firewall-D, Firewall-Config, and go ahead and hit enter. Now, the thing you need to remember is Firewall-D is actually installed by default on a base install of Red Hat 7, not on a minimum install of Red Hat 7. So you'll want to make sure that you either install the base using yum group listing or group install for the base install, or just go ahead and install your packages here. Now, just because we installed the package doesn't mean it's running. So we need to do a systemctl start Firewall-D. And then, of course, it needs to survive a reboot, so we need to do a systemctl enable on our Firewall-D so it starts when our system starts. So I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen. And now that we've done this, let's talk a little bit about how Firewall-D works. Firewall-D has two different modes, or two different ways we can make changes to our firewall rules. First, we can make what's called a runtime change. A runtime change does not require a reload of the Firewall-D configurations, and a runtime change only lives in the firewall rules for as long as that system service is running. So after the next reload or a reboot or a restart of the Firewall-D service, those changes we made at the run level will not be persistent. So in order to make permanent changes, we have to be intentional. So one of the big things about a Red Hat exam is you'll always hear people say, always, always, always try to make sure your settings survive a reboot. If we make a run level change and we reboot, it will not still be there. But then again, you may be asked to make only a run level change. These are things that you need to think about when you're working inside of the certification exam. So let's take a look at what's called a zone. I'm going to type Firewall-Cmd. That's our command for working on the command line. I'm then going to type get zones. Now, the way that Firewall-D works is it groups all of your rules inside of a zone. So your zones can have specific allowed IP addresses. So let's take, for example, your home network. A common home network IP address range internally is a 192.168 range. We could specify that all items in the 192.168.1/0 on the 1024 scale apply to this home zone. So if we were to add a rule to the home zone that says allow Samba file service, then any IP address coming from within this IP address range would be allowed to communicate with the Samba file service. So by default, we're always working inside of a zone. To get our default zone, because we're always working within a zone, and unless we change it, we're always inside of that specific default zone whenever we make rules if we don't specify a zone. So we'll do a firewall-cmd -get-default-zone. And that's going to show that we're always working in the public zone. So if we want to see our default zone, we would type firewall-cmd space -get-default-zone. Now that shows our default zone is public. So when we add a rule, unless we specify the zone, it's going to add it to our public zone. Now again, to list our available zones, we can do a firewall-cmd -get zones, and then there's the list of our zones. And if you forget how to do this, you can always do a firewall-cmd -help, and it's going to display help items. We also have a man firewall D, which is going to allow us to really look and also see the other available man pages as it relates to firewall D. So let's look at the rules we currently have in place for this system. So to do that, I'll do a firewall-cmd -list-all. And this is going to view the rules that are currently inside of our system. So for our public default zone, the services DHCP and SSH are allowed. Now, what's really cool about Firewall D is it has pre-built services that you can just reference by default. Instead of having to know the port, you could just reference the actual service name. Now, if we wanted to see a specific zone firewall rules, because if you saw before, it showed only the default. So if we did a firewall-cmd list all, you'll see it shows our default there. So let's do a firewall-cmd --zone equals home, and then we're going to list all. So all we're doing is specifying the zone. So our home zone, if you fall within our home zone rules, have these services allowed for communication. These ports essentially are open. So what IP address ranges do fall within our current home zone? Do we have those already configured? Well, the answer to that is no. We don't have any sources configured in our zone. So let's just arbitrarily say we're going to add in a source. So I'm going to say firewall-cmd. We're going to specify the zone, because if we don't specify the zone, then it's going to assume to be our default zone, which is currently public, which means coming from anywhere. So we'll have our zone equals home. And then we're going to add a source. So we'll do --add source, and then our IP address range. So for example, 192.168.1.0/24. And so now if we want to go back up and view all of our zones for the home, what we're going to see is that we have this source IP address range. So anything coming from one of these IP addresses has these rules applied to it. So we've now opened these rules to this IP address range. So again, if we have our public though, that's going to apply to everything. It's our public zone. We're able to use zones because inside of an environment, you might have a home network, a public network, an external network, a corporate network. And you might want to have rules based off all of those different IP addresses that are coming and going from your server inside of a corporate environment. Now, one thing that you need to realize is that if we reload our firewall rules by doing a firewall-cmd-reload, and then we were to take a look at our zone rules again by doing firewall-cmd-zone equals home list all, we're not going to see that IP address. The reason we're not going to see that IP address as a source or that IP address range is because we listed that as a run level or runtime change, which means after a reload or a reboot or restart of the service, that change is gone. It's not persistent. To make that change a permanent change, all we need to do is browse up here to our entry and specify permanent. So that's really simple. We'll do a --permanent. We make the change. We can view our rules. But wait, where's our change? Well, that's the caveat about a persistent change. You can make a run level change, but it doesn't require a reload of your service. But when you reload it, that run level change is gone. But when we add a permanent change, it doesn't apply until you reload the firewall configuration rules. So if you wanted to add a permanent change, that you didn't have to run a reload on, you would have to make two entries, one for permanent and one for runtime. So we would just do a firewall-cmd -- reload, hit enter, and then we could see our zone has been added. So now we're learning about zones, and zones apply to our sources. So we can group a set of IP address ranges into a zone rather than having to add a whole bunch of firewall rules for each IP address range or IP address. Let's group them in zones. That way we can add multiple ranges with one firewall rule. So anytime we make a firewall rule change to a zone, it'll apply to all of our sources within that zone. Let's go ahead and do a yum install HTTPD. We're going to use HTTPD service as an example here. Do a systemctl start HTTPD. Make sure that's started. I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen. Now, if I were to go to this server's IP address, which is my server 1 on linuxacademy.com lab servers, and let's head over to our second server here. And I'm going to issue a command called curl-k. It's going to issue an HTTP request and attempt to open the website. And if you see it failed to connect, well, the reason it failed to connect is because inside of our firewall rules, at least for public, we don't have port 80. So let's add port 80 to our public zone. Our public rule, again, is a catch-all. So because we're doing a default, I don't need to specify the zone. I can just do a firewall-cmd. If I wanted to specify the zone, I could say equals public, zone equals public. Now remember, if I don't, it's going to assume our default zone, which is currently public. And then I'm going to add the port 80, and it's a TCP port. So we're going to add port equals 80/TCP. And then we'll hit enter. Now remember, we didn't do permanent, so this is just a runtime change. I don't need to reload to apply those changes, but if I did reload, those changes would actually be lost. So now if we did a firewall-cmd -- zone equals public, list all, we're going to see that we have port 80. We could have created and added a service for HTTPD, but instead we just added port 80. So if we come back over here, and we do a curl on the IP address, well, what happens is our default page comes up. Now, since we're doing this in text, it's code. It's our HTML code, but this is our website. There's now a route to it because we opened that port inside of our public, and our public was a catch-all. So let's go ahead and run a reload, firewall-cmd -- reload. And then if we take a look and to view our rules, we're going to see that, well, we don't have port 80 there anymore. So if we were to come back over, and I'm going to clear my screen and attempt to do a curl, we're not going to have a route to the host. We've effectively denied access to that. So now all we have to do is maybe we want to create a permanent change. We would do that by doing firewall-cmd zone equals public, add port equals 80, and then TCP because it's a TCP port, and we're going to make the change permanent. So again, now that we've made this rule though, since it's a permanent change, we have to reload our firewall rules. So now after a reload, we can go ahead and list all. Because my default is public, it is going to show public, and we're going to see ports there is port 80. So it will actually survive a reboot now. It's persistent. So if we come over and do a curl, our stuff is going to show. Now, the same thing is if I was trying to SSH into my server 1, I could say SSH user at, and I'm able to SSH into it. Why? Did we create a rule for it? Well, no. By default, SSH is open on the public here. And this is port 22. That's going to allow us to SSH. Now, you might say, what happens if I have a router level firewall? And do I need a firewall or a load balancer firewall? Do I really need a firewall on my individual servers? And the answer to that question is yes. What happens if somebody gets past that first layer of protection? In this day and age, we absolutely need multiple layers of protection. So we're learning how to add these rules, and we're learning how to do it on zones. So our public zone applies to everything. It's a catch-all. And again, we learned how to add to our other zones. And then we've just learned how to add an individual port. So if we wanted to open up FTP, how would you do that on the public zone? Well, you would go over here, specify zone equals public, and then you would specify port 21. And you would add that, and that allows you to add it to FTP. So what happens if you just don't want to use the command line and you have access to a GUI-based interface? Well, because we installed a tool called Firewall Config, I can actually type that if I'm in a GUI-based interface. Remember, I'm actually VNC'd into my server 1, and then we SSH'd into our server 2. So inside of my server 1, since I'm in a GUI-based interface, I can launch this tool called Firewall Config. Now, one thing I want to show you before that is, let's say we don't have a running Firewall-D service. So we have a systemctl stop Firewall-D, and we open up our config. It's going to look like this. Basically down here, it's going to say no connection waiting. And if you're inside of an environment and you need to troubleshoot why is nothing showing up, that means your service isn't running. So just go start your service, systemctl start firewall-d. Always good practice at this point to just also do a systemctl enable firewall-d. Even though we already had it enabled, you'll probably want to make sure if you have to start it that it is enabled. You could check with the is-enabled command, and that would also work for you. And then we'll go ahead and run our firewall config. And what this is it's a GUI-based interface. So up here in our configuration, we can specify a runtime configuration change or a permanent configuration change. So currently, let's go ahead and look at our public network. So we're inside of public. We see we have specific services that are already available to us checked. Well, these are our services. If we don't know where to find our services, we can list services, or we could come over to ports. Now, our current firewall rule has our port 80 in there. So if we did a remove, this is a permanent change because we're under configuration permanent. So if we came over and attempted to do our curl again, do you think it would work? And the answer to that question is yes, because with the permanent change, you have to reload the configuration. So in order to reload the configuration, you would come to Options, Reload Firewall-D. Now that that's reloaded, if we came over, cleared our screen and did a curl again, it's not going to work. But again, if we wanted to make a runtime change and maybe add port 80, we could say port 80, hit OK. We're adding it to the public network. Now that we've done that, it's runtime, which means we don't have to reload it. But if we did reload it, what would happen? Our runtime configuration would be lost. See, it's no longer there. So let's talk about panic mode. I don't encourage you to enable panic mode on your lab server because it will kick you out. But what panic mode does is you can do Firewall-Cmd --panic-on. And that could also have been done inside of our configuration under the options in our GUI-based firewall config we just had open. But what's going to happen here is it's going to lock down everything but your local console. That's it. If you don't have access to the local console, you are going to be locked down. Well, let's find out the status of our panic. So we could just do a query panic, and you see that it's not on. Now we're going to complete this lesson, and I'm actually going to do a panic on. And what that's going to do is it's going to make my lab server completely unusable because it's going to shut down all of my ports. And I'm currently connected to my lab server through the VNC port. So if I do panic on, we're going to lose connection. And nothing happens. It literally stopped in the middle of everything. I can't do anything at all because it locks down everything. So that concludes it for this lesson. There's a really detailed self-paced lab at the end of this section on Firewall-D. I would encourage you to take that self-paced lab and also take a lot of notes. We also have our Firewall-D notes inside the advanced study guide available on the right-hand side of this course. So that concludes it for this lesson. Go ahead and complete this lesson.